I never expected to find myself standing in the grand ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel, watching my former business partner toast his newest acquisition. 10 years ago, James had stolen my architecture firm, my investors, and my fiancé. Tonight, with a single document hidden in my clutch, I'd finally reclaim what was rightfully mine. The moment he saw me across the crowded room, champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, I knew the years of quiet planning had been worth it. Before we dive deeper into this moment, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow I've saved something extra special that you won't want to miss. The annual Architectural Excellence Awards was the event of the season in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the ballroom filled with the industry's elite in designer evening wear. The air hummed with classical music from the string quartet and the constant murmur of networking conversations as the who's who of architecture mingled, champagne flutes in hand. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald silk gown, a custom piece that had cost more than my first car, and took a steadying breath. I had earned my place here. My sustainable design firm, Phoenix Architects, had just been nominated for the Breakthrough Urban Design of the Year, a validation of 5 years of relentless work rebuilding from the ashes of what James had destroyed. Tonight wasn't just about the award. It was my formal reintroduction to this circle as a genuine competitor, rather than the cautionary tale I'd become after my spectacular fall from grace. The invitation had arrived on heavy cardstock, and I'd nearly declined when I saw the list of nominees. Foster Architecture, James's company, built with my stolen designs, was nominated in 3 categories. But Marcus had convinced me otherwise, his dark eyes serious as he'd taken my hands in his. "Olivia, you've worked too hard to let the past keep you from celebrating this achievement," he'd said, his British accent becoming more pronounced as it always did when he was passionate about something. "Besides, I'll be right there with you." But Marcus was running late. A client emergency had detained him, leaving me to make my entrance alone. I had texted him twice already, trying to keep the anxiety from my messages. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and moved through the crowd with a practiced ease that would have shocked the version of me from a decade ago. I exchanged pleasantries with investors and fellow architects I recognized, projecting a confidence that had become real over time, not the facade I would have needed to maintain in those early days. Back then, I had been defining myself by my firm's prestige rather than the value of what I was creating. As I paused near an ice sculpture of the award's logo, I felt it, that distinct prickle at the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. I turned slowly, my heartbeat quickening as I scanned the crowd, and then I saw them. James Foster stood across the room, his trademark perfectly styled dark hair and megawatt smile exactly as I remembered. He was surrounded by a small group of admirers, gesturing animatedly as he held court. At his side was Robert, my former fiancé, looking elegant in a designer tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The platinum watch on his wrist caught the light as he laughed at something someone had said. They hadn't noticed me yet. For a moment, I was transported back in time, to our cramped first office with its mismatched furniture, to late nights drafting together, to the countless ideas we'd shared over cheap takeout and cheaper wine. To the day I'd introduced James, to Robert at a gallery opening, never suspecting he would betray me in the worst possible way. I considered retreating to find a quiet corner, to compose myself, to wait for Marcus's arrival before inevitably facing them. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I was no longer the devastated 28-year-old whose firm and fiancé had been stolen in one calculated move. I was Olivia Chen, founder and CEO of Phoenix Architects, with 3 award-winning projects and a growing international client base. A life rebuilt from the ground up. The moment stretched between us like a thread pulled taut, waiting to snap. And then it did. James's eyes met mine across the crowded room. There was a flash of recognition, followed by something I couldn't quite read. Surprise, discomfort, perhaps even a flash of guilt. It was quickly masked by a practiced smile as he whispered something to Robert and began making his way toward me. Each step he took across the marble floor was like a countdown. I took another sip of champagne, feeling the cool liquid contrast, with the warmth spreading through my chest. 10 years of distance, of healing, of building a new life. And yet his approach still triggered an instinctive fight-or-flight response. Olivia Chen. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, resonant and confident, with that undertone of charm that had once made investors open their checkbooks without seeing a single architectural rendering. It's been what, 10 years? James. I kept my tone neutral, neither warm nor cold. 9 years and 4 months, but who's counting? He air-kissed both my cheeks, a gesture so falsely intimate it made my skin crawl. The scent of his expensive cologne, something exclusive and surely overpriced, enveloped me momentarily. God, it's been forever. He stepped back, his eyes traveling over me in a swift assessment. I recognized that look. He was mentally calculating the worth of my gown, my jewelry, my overall presentation. Once, that appraisal would have made me shrink. Now I stood taller. Something like that, I replied, taking another sip of champagne. How have you been? Oh, busy, he laughed lightly. Foster Architecture just closed our expansion into Dubai. $300 million project. We're opening a London office, and I've been named to Architectural Digest's 40 Under 40 list. He flashed his left hand where a platinum wedding band caught the light. Rob and I celebrated 5 years married last month. Each achievement was delivered like a dart meant to pierce. I could see it in his eyes. He was waiting for me to flinch, to show some sign that his success with my stolen designs and my ex-fiancé still had the power to wound me. And you? He continued, his gaze dropping conspicuously to my left hand. Still single, I see? The old Olivia might have mumbled something self-deprecating, might have felt diminished by the comparison. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me as I heard familiar footsteps approaching from behind. Actually, I said, turning slightly as a warm hand came to rest on the small of my back. Meet my husband. The moment James's eyes shifted from me to the man beside me, I saw it. The flash of recognition followed by the blood draining from his face. His carefully composed expression crumbled as he took in the sight of Marcus Monroe, founding partner of Monroe Venture Partners, the firm handling the lawsuit against Foster Architecture for intellectual property theft. His champagne glass trembled, slightly in his hand. Marcus Monroe, he managed, extending his hand. I didn't realize you two knew each other. We've been married for 3 years now, I said, leaning slightly into Marcus's side, his arm slipping protectively around my waist. Marcus reviewed Phoenix's sustainable design concepts during our first development project. I fell in love with his brilliant mind before I even met him. The irony wasn't lost on me. While James had been impressed by Robert's social connections and family background, Marcus had first valued my work, my talent. He'd seen me as a professional before seeing me as a romantic prospect, something James had never truly done. James's smile returned, but it was strained at the edges. What a small world, he said, his voice hollow, and quite the coincidence. Not really a coincidence, Marcus replied pleasantly in his crisp British accent. We move in similar professional circles now. The emphasis on now hung in the air between us. James understood the implication. I was no longer the outsider looking in. I belonged in this world on my own merits, not as someone's +1 or stepping stone. How nice for you both, he said, his knuckles white around his champagne stem. Robert will be so surprised. He's just finishing up a conversation with some investors. He should be joining us any minute. The prospect of seeing Robert again, After all these years sent a brief flutter through my stomach, but it wasn't the devastating anxiety I once would have felt. It was more like the anticipation before a challenging client meeting, professional and controlled. "Actually," Marcus said smoothly, "we should probably avoid that particular reunion tonight. Professional ethics and all, given the circumstances." James's face flushed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" I asked quietly, holding his gaze. "The lawsuit regarding the sustainable urban development concepts, the stolen passive cooling system that bears a striking resemblance to the one I developed before you pushed me out?" His eyes widened slightly. "Those are baseless allegations. Our designs are wholly original and fully compliant with all intellectual property laws." "Is that what your lawyers are telling you?" Marcus asked, his tone still pleasant, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "Because the evidence suggests otherwise. 3 former Foster Architecture associates have already provided sworn statements." I watched as James's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble in real time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His eyes darted between us, the confident charm replaced by something I hadn't seen from him in a decade: uncertainty. "Mr. Foster," a young woman in event staff attire approached us, breaking the tension. "The nominees are being seated for the award announcements. Your table is ready." Relief flooded James's face. "Excuse me," he said stiffly. "Duty calls." "Likewise," I replied as he walked away, his back rigid with tension. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Marcus turned to me, concern etched across his features. "You okay?" "Actually, yes," I said, surprised to find it was true. That was easier than I expected. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." We moved toward our assigned table, away from where James and Robert would be seated. I could see James, across the room, whispering urgently to Robert, whose back was to us. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in Robert's shoulders as James spoke. "Do you think he's warning him about us?" I asked Marcus. Marcus nodded. "Undoubtedly. But it doesn't matter. The evidence doesn't change based on whether he sees us tonight or not." "Is it really as bad as we implied?" I asked quietly. Marcus rarely discussed the details of his firm's dealings with me, maintaining strict professional boundaries. His expression turned serious. "Worse, actually. They've been passing off your sustainable design concepts as their own for years. When another architect recognized elements of your work and raised questions, they threatened legal action to silence her." The information hit me like a physical blow. I had known James was ambitious, had sometimes questioned his ethical flexibility, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. The man I had once considered my best friend had prioritized profit over integrity and innovation. "You don't seem surprised," Marcus noted, studying my face. "I'm not really," I admitted. There were signs I ignored, times when his ambition seemed to outweigh everything else. A server approached with a tray of champagne. Marcus took 2 glasses, handing one to me. "To seeing clearly," he said, touching his glass to mine. "To second chances," I replied, taking a sip. As we stood there, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange twist of fate that had brought us all to this moment. 10 years ago, finding James and Robert together had destroyed me. I had believed they had taken everything from me. My future, my confidence, my sense of belonging. Now I understood that they had actually set me free. Across the room, Robert finally turned, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on us. For a moment, our gazes locked. There was no dramatic reaction, no visible shock, just a slight narrowing of his eyes as he recognized me, then widened as they shifted to Marcus. "James said something to him," his hand at the small of Robert's back, and he nodded, his expression hardening before they moved toward their table. It was clear they would be avoiding us for the remainder of the evening. "Well, that was anticlimactic," I murmured to Marcus. He chuckled. "Were you expecting him to faint dramatically?" "Not exactly," I smiled. "But after James's reaction, I thought there might be, I don't know, something more." "Men like Robert are practiced at hiding their reactions," Marcus said. "But trust me, he's rattled. Finding out his husband's ex-partner is married to the man leading the lawsuit against them, that's going to keep him up tonight." As we took our seats at our table, I was acutely aware of James and Robert circulating on the opposite side of the room, carefully maintaining distance. Occasionally I would catch Robert watching us, his expression unreadable before he quickly looked away. A memory surfaced, unexpected but vivid. The day I met Robert at a design gala where I was showcasing my sustainable urban housing concept. He had been representing his father's development company, his confidence and sharp questions immediately impressing me. When he'd approached afterward to continue the conversation over coffee, I had been flattered by his interest, surprised that someone from his world would be interested in me. "You know what's strange," I said, turning to face Marcus. "Looking back, I'm not sure Robert ever really knew me. He liked the idea of me, the promising female architect with the next big thing, but he never really saw me." "His loss," Marcus said simply. "That's what I noticed first about you. How much there was to see." I smiled, remembering our first meeting 6 years ago. I had been pitching to Monroe Venture Partners, nervous but determined. Marcus had asked questions no investor had ever asked before, wanting to understand the ethics behind my sustainable approach, not just its market potential. "Do you ever wonder how different things might have been?" Marcus asked carefully. "If they hadn't betrayed you?" I considered the question, watching a server move slowly through the crowd with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Sometimes. But then I wouldn't have found my way to you, and honestly, I don't think I would have found my way to myself either. I was so caught up in being what James and the investors wanted that I was losing sight of why I started designing sustainable spaces in the first place." Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Still, it couldn't have been easy, the way it happened." "No," I admitted. "It wasn't." The discovery of their betrayal had been devastating, not just because of what I'd lost, but how I'd lost it. The memory still had the power to make my chest tighten, even after all these years. "We should head back in," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I spotted the Watanabe team earlier. They mentioned they're looking to develop a sustainable residential complex in Tokyo." Marcus smiled at my deliberate change of subject. Always the professional. "It's how I survived," I said simply. "One foot in front of the other, one project at a time." As we turned to re-enter the main ballroom, I caught sight of Robert watching us from just inside the doors. Our eyes met briefly before he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. "You know," Marcus said as we walked back into the light and music. "Some people never face consequences for the pain they cause others, but sometimes life has a way of balancing the scales." I glanced across the room to where James stood now, deep in conversation with what appeared to be a group of potential clients. His posture was rigid, his smile forced. Whatever Robert had told him about us, it had clearly disrupted his evening. "Yes," I agreed. "Sometimes it does." "I still can't believe they rejected that sustainable housing proposal after all our work," James exclaimed, grabbing another slice of pizza from the box between us. We were sitting on the floor of our tiny office, celebrating our first major commission with cheap wine and cheaper food. Their excuse about market viability was such obvious sexism. They just couldn't handle that the lead architect was a woman. It was 3 years after we'd graduated from Columbia, and 2 years since we'd started Chen Foster Architecture, our sustainable design firm. The office was barely more than a glorified closet in a rundown building on the edges of Chelsea, but it was ours. Not everyone understands that sustainability isn't just a feature, it's the foundation, I replied, wiping my hands before returning to my sketches. That's our advantage. James nodded, his eyes bright with the fervor that had drawn me to partner with him in the first place. Exactly. While everyone's chasing glass towers, we're building structures that will stand the test of time. Speaking of which, that passive cooling system you designed is brilliant, Liv. Once we register the design, we'll be in a whole different league. Pride warmed my chest. The system represented months of work, countless late nights, and more caffeine than any human should consume. It wasn't just innovative, it was potentially revolutionary. A method of cooling large structures that was both more efficient and more sustainable than industry standards. Registration paperwork is almost ready, I said. Should be filed by the end of the month. Perfect timing for the Green Building Conference. The big players will all be there. James leaned back against the wall, his expression turning thoughtful. You know, this could be it, the breakthrough that puts us on the map. I remember feeling a flicker of unease at his emphasis on recognition rather than impact, but I dismissed it. That was just James, always thinking about the next level, the bigger stage. It was part of what made him such a good frontman for our firm. While I was comfortable diving deep into technical details, James thrived in the spotlight, pitching our vision and charming investors. As long as it helps create more sustainable cities, I'm happy, I said, returning to the elevation. I was refining. Sure, James agreed quickly, reaching for his phone as it buzzed with a notification. But the recognition doesn't hurt. Which reminds me, the Columbia Alumni Art Gala is tomorrow night. We should both go. I groaned. Another networking event? I've got this structural plan to finish. The structure can wait one night, he insisted. This is the perfect audience for us. Hungry developers looking for innovative architects, plus some serious investment money circulating. Besides, he added with a grin, Robert Mitchell will be there. The developer's son? I asked, suddenly more interested. I'd met Robert briefly at a green building competition months earlier, and had been struck by his intelligence and appreciation for sustainable design. The very same. He specifically asked if you'd be attending. James's grin widened. Apparently, your explanation of passive thermal regulation made quite an impression. The memory dissolved as I stood in the present, watching James across the ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel. He was now speaking with the awards organizer, their heads bent close in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in his stance, the forced casualness in his gestures. They look worried, I murmured to Marcus. They should be, he replied quietly. The evidence we've gathered is substantial. Their legal team has been trying to negotiate a settlement for weeks. I studied James's profile, trying to reconcile the man I saw now with the one I had once considered my brother in all but blood. He looked older, of course, his boyish features now sharper, more defined. But there was something else different about him. A hardness that perhaps had always been there, but that I'd been too trusting to recognize. It's strange, I said, seeing him now and realizing how little I actually knew him. Marcus's eyes were thoughtful. We rarely see people clearly when we're in love with the idea of them. His words struck a chord. That had been exactly my mistake, falling in love with the idea of James Foster, brilliant co-founder and perfect business partner, rather than seeing the real man with all his flaws and ambitions. The months after founding Chen Foster had been a whirlwind of excitement and potential. James had introduced me to his world with pride, and I had thrown myself into becoming the perfect creative partner for our rising architectural firm. I'd attended gallery openings and investor meetings, learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the high-end design world. Meanwhile, Robert had become increasingly involved in our lives. What had started as occasional coffee meetings to discuss potential projects with his father's development firm had evolved into dinners, then dating. James had encouraged the relationship enthusiastically, seemingly genuinely happy for me. "Ms. Monroe," a voice broke through my thoughts. A woman in her 50s with a sharp bob and sharper eyes was approaching us. "I'm Diane Werner, Sustainability Director at Lockwell Properties." Marcus shook her hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Ms. Werner. I wanted to personally thank your wife for her extraordinary work on our Toronto complex," she said, turning to me. "The energy efficiency numbers are exceeding even our most optimistic projections." Pride warmed my chest. That means everything to hear. Creating spaces that are both beautiful and sustainable was the entire goal. Ms. Werner lowered her voice slightly. "I should also mention that not all of us in the industry are aligned with Foster's practices. Some of us have been raising concerns about design attribution for quite some time." Marcus nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I appreciate your candor, Ms. Werner. Integrity matters in architecture," she said simply, "as does giving credit where it's due." With a meaningful look between us, she excused herself to rejoin a group of colleagues. "That was interesting," I murmured to Marcus once she was out of earshot. "Very," he agreed. "The industry is presenting a united front publicly, but clearly, there are internal divisions." As we continued mingling, I found myself drawn back into memories of that golden period before everything fell apart. Robert and I had been planning our future together, a brownstone in the West Village, perhaps children in a few years, my architecture career developing alongside his rising position in his father's development company. I had believed we were building something lasting and real. One particular memory surfaced. A rare Saturday when both Robert and I had the day free. We'd spent the morning at the Museum of Modern Art, then walked through Central Park, talking about everything and nothing. "I never thought I'd find someone who fits so perfectly into my life," he'd said, his arm around my waist as we watched model boats on the conservatory water. "You understand the development world, you impress my father's partners, and you're building something that could be huge. You're exactly what I need, Olivia." At the time, I'd taken it as a beautiful compliment. Now, with years of distance and clarity, I recognized the subtle warning sign in his words. He'd been focused on how I fit into his life, how I met his needs, not on who I was as a person separate from what I could be for him. Looking up, I realized Robert was watching us again from across the room. This time he didn't look away when our eyes met. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, he began walking toward us, determination in his stride. "Incoming," I murmured to Marcus, who followed my gaze and straightened slightly. "Olivia," Robert said as he reached us, his voice artificially bright. "I was hoping to catch you alone for a moment, for old time's sake." Marcus's posture shifted subtly, protective. "Is that a good idea?" "It's okay," I assured him, though my heart had begun beating faster. "I can handle this." Marcus studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be right over there with the Lockwell team if you need me," he said, squeezing my hand before stepping away. Robert watched him go, something unreadable in his expression. "He seems devoted," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "He is," I replied simply. "What did you want to talk about, Robert?" He glanced around, then gestured toward a relatively quiet corner near the terrace doors. "Could we—" I followed him, maintaining a careful emotional distance despite our physical proximity. The man beside me looked like my former fiancé, but he felt like a stranger, or worse, like someone who had once known exactly how to hurt me and had chosen to do so. When we reached the corner, he turned to face me, his composure slightly fractured. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," he began. "Clearly," I replied, unable to keep a hint of dryness from my tone. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Olivia, about what happened. It was 10 years ago. Ancient history, I interrupted. His eyes searched my face. Is it, though? You married the venture capitalist who's suing my husband's firm. That seems deliberate. I felt a flash of anger. Not everything is about you, Robert, or James. Marcus and I met years after I left New York, completely independent of any connection to either of you. The fact that his firm is handling the lawsuit is coincidental. Is it? He challenged, doubt clear in his voice. Yes, I said firmly, though I understand why someone who orchestrated betrayal might have difficulty believing in coincidence. He flinched slightly at my words. I deserved that, he admitted after a moment. But there are things you don't know, Olivia, about what happened back then, about James. I studied his face, noting the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the tightness in his smile that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. You're right, I said evenly. There are many things I don't know, and I've made peace with that. James is under tremendous pressure, he confided, his voice lowered. The lawsuit, the Dubai project. He's not sleeping, barely eating. I'm worried about him. The admission surprised me. This wasn't the conversation I had expected to have. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I didn't wish personal suffering on either of them. But if he's stealing other architects' designs and claiming them as his own, that's not pressure, that's a choice. The market demands innovation at any cost, he argued. If he didn't deliver, someone else would have. That's a convenient narrative, I replied. But it doesn't change the reality that real people's work and intellectual property were stolen. He looked away, his profile sharp against the soft lighting of the ballroom. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Because from where I stand, it seems pretty straightforward. James took my sustainable design concepts, built Foster architecture on them, then claimed them as his own for profit. He believes in what he's building, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. So did I said quietly. That didn't stop him from pushing me out of my own firm. Pain flashed across his face. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Then explain it to me, I challenged. After 10 years, I think I deserve that much. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his champagne glass. James saw potential in your designs that you didn't. He wanted to move faster, scale bigger, while you were obsessed with perfecting every sustainable detail. Because that was the entire point, I interjected, to build something that actually protected the environment and served communities. But the market wasn't ready for that level of idealism, he continued. James recognized that a good enough approach that could scale quickly was more valuable than a perfect solution that might never reach mass adoption. So he decided I was in the way. He decided you had different visions, he corrected. He went to my father first, convinced him that the firm needed a different direction. Dad agreed to fund James's vision, but only if the company was restructured. The pieces were falling into place, with you as the go-between. He didn't deny it. I did care about you, Olivia. That wasn't a lie. Just not enough to be honest with me. I thought I was protecting you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. James said if you fought the restructuring, it would get ugly. This way, you got a buyout package, a clean break. While you got what? James? The prestige of being married to a rising star architect? I got a partnership, he said, an edge to his voice. Someone who understood what real ambition looked like. The implication hung in the air between us, that I hadn't been that partner, that I'd had limits James found inconvenient, and Robert did not. I remember when things started to change, I said slowly, memories flooding back. About 6 months before the buyout, you both started acting differently. James became obsessed with growth, with press coverage, less interested in the fundamental sustainability principles. And you? What? He asked, an edge to his voice. You became his echo chamber, always talking about scalability, about market, trends, about how sustainability was just a selling point, not the foundation. At the time, I thought you were just being supportive of the firm. Now I see you were helping him prepare the ground for my removal. A waiter passed by, offering champagne. We both declined. Did you know, I continued, that about 2 months before the board meeting where I was voted out, I actually wondered if something was happening. I asked James point blank if he was planning to restructure the firm without me. He seemed genuinely shocked at the suggestion. He put his hand on my shoulder and said I was being paranoid, that we were partners, that Chen Foster was our shared vision. Robert's eyes widened slightly. What did he say exactly? He told me I should talk to you about my irrational fears. He said you could reassure me because you understood the vision better than anyone, that you believed in what we were building together. His face paled. I didn't know he did that. Really? Because I called you that same night, remember? I was almost in tears, confessing my fears about losing the firm. And you told me I was being insecure, that James adored me as a partner, that I needed to be more understanding of the market pressures we were under. He looked away. I remember. You gaslighted me, I said quietly. Both of you, for months. Across the room I could see Marcus watching us, concern evident in his posture. I gave him a small nod to indicate I was okay. We were wrong, Robert finally admitted. The way we handled it was wrong. I've known that for years. Then why? Did you approach me tonight with that smug assessment about my being single? Why continue the pretense that you have the perfect life when your husband is facing serious legal trouble? He closed his eyes briefly. Habit, he said. The habit of pretending everything is perfect. For the first time, I looked at the man standing before me, beyond the designer tuxedo and expensive watch. I saw the strain in his features, the carefully concealed anxiety. The Robert I'd known in our early dating days had been vibrant and carefree. This man seemed brittle somehow. Are you happy, Robert? I asked, the question emerging before I could stop it. His eyes snapped to mine, startled by the unexpected query. For a moment I thought he might respond with his typical bravado. Instead, something in his expression cracked. I don't know, he whispered. I haven't asked myself that question in a very long time. The honesty of his response caught me off guard. I had expected defensiveness, not vulnerability. The life you envied all those years ago, he continued, being James Foster's husband, having the prestige and the connections. It came with a price. James is not an easy man to be married to. No, I agreed softly. I don't imagine he would be. A weighted silence fell between us, heavy with shared history and divergent paths. When did you first realize? I began, then paused, uncertain, if I really wanted the answer, that you had feelings for him, or that he had them for you. He twisted the platinum wedding band on his finger. I admired him from the moment you introduced us. His vision, his charisma, his certainty about his place in the world. But I didn't act on it. I wouldn't have. Not until what? Until he told me about his doubts, he said, about your partnership. The admission still had the power to sting, even after all these years. When was this? About 5 months before the board meeting. He said he respected your creative brilliance, but wasn't sure you truly understood the business they were building. He said you had limitations. Limitations, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. Your unwillingness to compromise. On sustainability features for cost considerations, your hesitation about certain growth strategies he felt were necessary for the firm's survival, your insistence on proper attribution for design elements. I almost laughed. You mean my limitations were that I had ethical boundaries and wanted to build something that actually made a positive impact? He didn't answer directly. He found in me someone who understood that sometimes compromises need to be made to achieve greatness. The picture he painted was becoming clearer. So you became his accomplice, not just his lover. His expression hardened slightly. I became his partner in every sense. And now, with the lawsuit pending? Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. We'll get through it. We always do. But there was a hollow quality to his confident assertion that told me more than his words did. I should get back to James, he said, straightening his shoulders. He'll be wondering where I've gone. As he turned to leave, I found myself saying, Robert. He paused, looking back at me questioningly. Whatever happens with the lawsuit, I hope you find a way to be happy. Really happy, not just the appearance of it. Surprise registered on his face, followed by something that might have been gratitude. You always were better than me, he said softly. Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd of glittering guests. It was a rainy Tuesday when my world collapsed. I remember every detail with perfect clarity, the steady drumming of water against the windows of our office, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air, the stack of sustainable design. Plans waiting on my desk for final review. James had canceled our client meeting that morning, citing the need to prepare a special presentation for the board. It wasn't unusual, as our firm gained momentum, for him to handle the business side while I focused on the architectural details. But that day, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake propelled me to action. I'll help with the presentation, I told myself, gathering my portfolio. 2 heads are better than 1. The Uber dropped me at our new office building, a significant upgrade from our original closet-sized space, now that we had secured Series A funding. I waved to the receptionist as I made my way to the conference room where James had said he would be working. Light spilled from beneath the conference room door, a strip of gold in the dimly lit corridor. I approached quietly, planning to surprise him with some new sustainability features I'd developed overnight. I didn't knock. That single decision, reaching for the handle instead of announcing myself, altered the course of my life irrevocably. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a scene that stopped my heart. James was there, but he wasn't preparing a presentation. He was seated at the head of the table with Robert beside him. Across from them sat 3 people I recognized immediately, the board members who had invested in our Series A, along with Robert's father, Martin Mitchell. So we're agreed, Martin was saying, sliding documents across the table toward James. Chen gets a 5% stake and a one-time payout. The revised structure gives you controlling interest and the freedom to pivot toward the scalable model we've discussed. She won't take it quietly, one of the board members cautioned. James's voice was coldly confident. She will when Robert explains it's for the best. She trusts him completely. Robert nodded, his hand covering James's on the table. Olivia is reasonable. She'll understand this is the right business decision, especially when I help her see it as a chance to focus on the creative work she loves without the pressure of firm leadership. My portfolio slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud that finally alerted them to my presence. All 5 heads turned toward me with matching expressions of shock. Olivia, James recovered first, standing up and putting distance between himself and Robert. This isn't... Don't, I interrupted, my voice eerily calm despite the hurricane raging inside me. Don't insult me by saying this isn't what it looks like. Robert's face had drained of color, but he didn't didn't attempt to explain or apologize. His silence was another betrayal, cutting as deeply as the scene I'd witnessed. How long? I asked, the calm in my voice belying the trembling of my hands. How long have you been planning to push me out of my own firm? James exchanged a glance with Martin Mitchell. Olivia, let's discuss this privately. This isn't the place. How long? I repeated, each word precisely enunciated. 3 months of formal planning, Martin finally admitted, his businessman's pragmatism taking over. But James has been expressing concerns about your unwillingness to compromise on certain design elements for some time. Something about the specificity of his answer, not recently, or it just happened, but 3 months, told me the conspiracy had been developing far longer. I see, I said, though I didn't, not really. I couldn't comprehend how the two people I trusted most in the world, my business partner and my fiancé, could do this to me. And you were going to tell me? When? After you'd already restructured the firm I built from nothing? Olivia, you're upset, James said, using the same soothing tone he probably employed with nervous clients. Let me take you for a coffee and we can talk about this rationally. Rationally? I echoed, a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in my throat. You want to rationally discuss how you and my fiancé have been conspiring with our investors to dilute my ownership of the firm I founded, while plotting to leverage his relationship with me to make it go down easier? Robert finally spoke, his voice small. Olivia, I'm so sorry. We never meant to hurt you. The platitude ignited something in me. You never meant to hurt me? What exactly did you think would happen when I found out my fiancé and business partner were planning to cut me out of my own company? That I'd be thrilled for you both? We were going to offer you fair compensation, Martin interjected, ever the businessman. You'd retain a small equity stake, receive a generous cash payment, and could remain as design director under James's leadership, I finished for him, with no voting rights or control over the firm's direction. The silence that followed confirmed my understanding. The board has already voted, Martin said, almost apologetically. The restructuring happens next week. I looked between them, Martin with his calculating gaze, James with his carefully controlled expression, Robert with tears now streaming. Down his face, the board members watching the drama unfold with detached interest. In that moment, a strange clarity descended. These people were strangers to me. Whatever I had believed about them, about us, had been an illusion. I see, I said flatly. Thank you for your honesty, at least. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the firm I had built and the future I had planned. It wasn't until I reached the street that I realized it was still raining, the cold water soaking through my clothes as I stood there, momentarily directionless. I didn't cry in the Uber ride home, or while I packed my essential designs and blueprints, or even when I called my parents to tell them the engagement was off. The tears came later, when I was safely in a hotel room, staring at the Chen Foster Architecture website, where my name and photo had already been removed from the leadership team. They came in a flood then, hot and relentless, my body finally, processing what my mind was still struggling to accept. 10 years later, standing in the ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel, the memory of that day still had the power to make my chest tighten. But the pain had long since been replaced by something else, understanding that their betrayal, as devastating as it had been, had set me free from a business partnership and relationship that would have slowly diminished me. You okay? Marcus appeared at my side, handing me a fresh glass of sparkling water. That looked intense, he added, nodding toward where Robert had disappeared into the crowd. It was, I admitted, taking a grateful sip. He just confirmed what we already suspected about James's ethics. He also inadvertently revealed that their marriage isn't exactly the fairy tale they pretend it is. Marcus's expression was thoughtful. People rarely get away with their choices forever. Consequences have a way of finding us all, eventually. Across the room, I could see James engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with one of the award organizers. Robert stood slightly apart, his smile fixed, but his eyes anxious as he watched the exchange. "What do you think will happen?" I asked Marcus quietly. "With the lawsuit?" "Foster Architecture will settle," he replied with certainty. "The evidence is too damning, and they know it. The real question is whether the professional architectural associations will revoke James's credentials for the ethical violations." The thought should have given me satisfaction, a form of justice for the betrayal I had suffered. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also a strange sort of pity for the man who had once been my closest friend. "Would it be terrible to admit that I don't wish that on him?" I asked. "As much as he hurt me, I don't want to see his career destroyed." Marcus's eyes softened. "That's not terrible, Olivia. It's compassionate. It's one of the things I love most about you, your capacity for empathy, even toward those who don't deserve it." I leaned against him slightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. After I left New York, I spent months fantasizing about revenge, ways to hurt James and Robert as deeply as they had hurt me. But eventually, I realized that living well, truly well, not just the appearance of it, was the only revenge that wouldn't poison me in the process. "And you've certainly accomplished that," Marcus said, pride evident in his voice. The memory of those first months after the betrayal surfaced, the raw pain, the humiliation of being ousted from my own firm, the struggle to rebuild my sense of self. I had retreated to my parents' house in Boston, barely leaving my childhood bedroom for weeks. The designs for our sustainable urban housing, my designs, sitting untouched on my laptop, a painful reminder of dreams shattered. But then came the pivotal moment, the day I finally made the decision that would alter my course. I'd been listlessly scrolling through architecture news when I came across a profile of James in Architectural Digest. The headline read, "Foster Architecture, Sustainable Design for the Future." There was James, grinning confidently at the camera, quoted extensively about his innovative approach to urban sustainability. My approach, my designs, my vision, but with all mention of me carefully excised from the narrative. Something snapped inside me as I stared at that image, not in a destructive way, but in a clarifying one, like a fever breaking. I realized with sudden certainty that I had two choices. I could continue to let their betrayal define me, or I could use it as a catalyst to create something new. That same day, I opened my laptop and began designing again. Not to recreate what I'd lost, but to build something better, something that truly reflected my original vision. Architecture that actually served communities, that put sustainability first. That wasn't just another firm's marketing point to be leveraged for profit. I called a former professor who had connections at a sustainability firm in Chicago, as far from New York as I could reasonably go. And I deleted all my social media accounts, cutting off my view into James's new life with my firm and my former fiancé. It wasn't a dramatic declaration of war. It was a quiet decision to redirect my energy from what I had lost to what I could create. That day changed everything for me, I told Marcus, finishing the story I'd shared with him in pieces over the years of our relationship. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, what I wanted, who I wanted to be. "And look what you've built," he said softly. "A thriving, sustainable architecture firm, a reputation for ethical excellence, and clients who value not just your design brilliance, but your integrity." "And you," I added, meeting his gaze. "I found you." He smiled, the warmth in his eyes dispelling the last shadows of the past. We found each other, and I'm grateful every day for that. The orchestra began playing a waltz, the elegant melody filling the ballroom. Marcus extended his hand. "Dance with me." As we moved across the floor, I caught a glimpse of James watching us his expression unreadable. Robert stood beside him, his hand on James's arm in a gesture that now seemed more restraining than affectionate. "He's watching us," I murmured to Marcus. "Let him," Marcus replied, drawing me closer. "Let him see exactly what he lost." In that moment, with Marcus's arms around me and the music sweeping us along, I felt the final piece of my healing click into place. The story of James and Robert's betrayal was no longer my defining narrative. It was simply a chapter in a much larger, richer story, one that I continued to write on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the true victory. Not the fact that they might finally face consequences for their actions, but that I had long since moved beyond needing them to. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The month after discovering James and Robert's conspiracy in the conference room was a blur of pain and practicalities. There were legal battles over intellectual property, awkward explanations to friends in the architectural community, and the logistical nightmare of disentangling my life from the one I had planned with Chen Foster and Robert. I had moved out of our shared apartment in Manhattan to my parents' house in Boston, leaving behind furniture, memories, and the life I had carefully constructed. The engagement ring, which Robert had tearfully returned via courier with a handwritten letter I couldn't bring myself to read, sat in its velvet box on my childhood dresser, a glittering reminder of promises broken. "You need to decide what you want to do about the legal settlement," my mother had said gently one evening, finding me staring at the open box. 5% equity and a payout isn't nothing, especially if Foster Architecture succeeds. I knew she was right, but something in me resisted finalizing the settlement. Accepting their terms felt like the final acknowledgement that it was over, that the firm I had built was truly gone. But it wasn't just the lost firm that hollowed me out. It was the loss of James, my best friend, my business partner, the person who had been my constant through the roller coaster of startup life. His betrayal cut even deeper than Robert's in some ways. He had been in my life since college. Robert had been a more recent addition. I discovered the full extent of their deception in pieces over those first few weeks. Former colleagues called hesitantly, revealing that James and Robert had been spotted together at investor meetings when both had claimed to be elsewhere. A junior designer reached out apologetically, explaining that James had been working on rebranding the firm's direction for months before my removal. "I assumed you were on board with the changes," she said uncomfortably. "Otherwise, I would have said something." The most painful revelation came from my former roommate from Columbia, who had remained in the city after graduation. "I can't keep this from you anymore," she confessed over a video call, her eyes filled with apprehension. "James was meeting with Mitchell Development regularly, without you, for at least 6 months before the restructuring. The private meetings were an open secret among the developer crowd. 6 months, not the 3 months Martin had claimed. Not a recent development, or a moment of weakness, but a calculated long-term deception by both of them. The betrayal was complete. While I had been perfecting our sustainable designs, sharing my insecurities with my fiancé, and building what I thought was a life with the man I loved and a firm with my best friend, they had been carrying on behind my back. Not just an affair, but an elaborate web of lies that made me question every interaction, every memory, every moment I had shared with either of them. And then came the social media announcement that nearly broke me. 8 weeks after I had discovered their conspiracy, James posted a glittering press release on LinkedIn announcing Foster Architecture's successful rebranding and Series B funding round, $25 million at a $100 million valuation. The post included a photo of him with Robert at his side, his hand possessively on Robert's shoulder as he was identified as Robert Mitchell, Director of Business Development. The caption read, "Excited to announce Foster Architecture's latest milestone with my brilliant partner in business and life. Sustainable designs for a better tomorrow. Comments flooded in. Congratulations from design luminaries. Excitement from fellow architects. Supportive emojis from mutual friends who either didn't know the full story or chose to ignore it. The casual cruelty of it staggered me. Not only had they betrayed me, but they were now rewriting the narrative, erasing me from their story as if I had never existed, as if the sustainable designs at the heart of Foster architecture hadn't been born in my mind, drafted by my hands during countless sleepless nights. I shut down my LinkedIn account that same day. I still can't believe they went public with their relationship so quickly after everything that happened, Marcus said, pulling me back to the present. We had moved to a quiet corner of the ballroom, momentarily retreating from the bustle of the gala. In retrospect, it makes perfect sense, I replied. They needed to legitimize their relationship as quickly as possible. An official partnership transformed them from conspirators to a power couple. Marcus's expression was contemplative. How did you hear about their wedding? That must have been another blow. I smiled wryly. Actually, by then I was in Chicago, starting my new life. I only found out when a former college friend mentioned it in passing during a phone call, clearly unaware that I didn't know. By that point, I was 9 months into my position at Green Horizon Architects, a respected firm that had given me the space to begin developing what would eventually become Phoenix Architects' core sustainable designs. I remember feeling not happy exactly, but not devastated either. Progress. Slow progress, I acknowledged to Marcus. There were still bad days. Days when I'd see a sustainable project that reminded me of what Chen Foster could have been, or when another announcement would appear for someone else's happy day, but they became less frequent. Across the ballroom, I noticed James and Robert preparing to leave, their body language tense despite the social smiles fixed on their faces. James's hand was at the small of Robert's back, guiding him toward the exit with what appeared to be practiced urgency. They're leaving, I observed. Marcus followed my gaze. Not surprising. Their legal team is probably having fits, knowing James is in the same room as the partner of the firm that's suing them. I'm surprised they stayed as long as they did, I mused. Appearances, Marcus said simply. In their world, leaving early from an event like this would be an admission of weakness. They'd rather endure discomfort than show vulnerability. Her insight struck me as profoundly true. James and Robert had always been consumed with appearances, with the image they projected to the world. It was what had drawn them together and what now seemed to be holding them in a gilded cage of their own making. As they reached the ballroom doors, Robert looked back, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. For a brief moment, something passed between us. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or a question unasked. Then James's hand at his waist urged him forward, and they disappeared into the hotel lobby. An unexpected weight lifted from my shoulders with their departure. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying, knowing they were in the same room until it was suddenly gone. You know what's strange? I said to Marcus. For years after the betrayal, I imagined this moment, seeing them again, showing them I was fine, maybe even better than fine. I thought it would feel more, I don't know, triumphant. And it doesn't? He asked curiously. I considered the question. It does, in a way, but mostly I just feel sad for them. They got what they wanted, each other, status, recognition, but they don't seem happy. The price of getting what you want through deception, Marcus said, quietly, is never being able to fully trust in it. They'll always wonder if what happened to you could happen to them. The wisdom of his observation resonated deeply. I had never considered that aspect of their betrayal. The seed of doubt. It must have planted in their own relationship. If James could conspire with Robert to push me out, might he not do the same to Robert if a better opportunity came along? If Robert could betray his fiancée, what else might he be capable of? In those dark months after discovering their affair, and the conspiracy to remove me from Chen Foster, I had felt like I had lost everything. My firm, my fiancé, my best friend, my place in the architectural community, the future I had planned, all gone in an instant. The grief had been all-consuming, a physical ache that followed me through days that blurred into each other. I remembered one particularly low moment, about 2 months after the betrayal, when I had run into a former colleague at a coffee shop in Boston. She had asked about Chen Foster, clearly unaware of what had happened. When I explained the situation in halting words, her expression had shifted from shock to pity. "Oh, Olivia," she had said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You poor thing. Are you okay?" The pity in her eyes had been unbearable, worse somehow than the pain of the betrayal itself. I wasn't poor Olivia, the victim of a cruel deception. Or at least I didn't want to be that. That moment in the cafe had crystallized something for me. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to be defined by what had been done to me. I wanted to be defined by what I would do next. That was when I decided to apply for positions in Chicago. I needed a clean break, I told Marcus, continuing the story. Not just from James and Robert, but from being seen as their victim. It was about self-preservation. "It was brave," Marcus said, his eyes warm with admiration. "Moving across the country, starting over, not everyone could have done that." I shook my head slightly. It wasn't bravery so much as survival. I couldn't heal in an environment where everyone knew what had happened, where I might run into them at any moment. I needed space to figure out who I was without them. "And who did you discover you were?" he asked, genuinely curious. The question made me smile. Someone stronger than I knew. Someone with ambitions beyond being James Foster's creative partner. Someone who could build a life on her own terms. The orchestra began playing a slower melody, drawing couples to the dance floor for the final numbers of the evening. Marcus extended his hand to me. "Dance with me one more time before we call it a night." As we swayed together beneath the crystal chandeliers, I found myself reflecting on the strange circular nature of life. 10 years ago, I had believed that James's betrayal was the end of my story. Instead, it had been merely a painful chapter in a much longer, richer narrative. The woman I had become in the aftermath, more resilient, more authentic, more confident in her own worth, was someone I might never have discovered had my partnership with James proceeded as planned. The sustainable architecture firm I had built, the life I now led with Marcus, the sense of purpose I had found, none of it would exist in the same form if I had remained James's creative partner at Foster Architecture. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus murmured, his cheek against my hair. "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best things in your life," I replied honestly. "If James hadn't betrayed me with Robert, I might never have found my way to you." His arms tightened around me. Then I owe them a debt of gratitude, though I doubt they'd appreciate the sentiment. I laughed softly, the sound lost in the music surrounding us. "No, I don't imagine they would." As the song drew to a close, I caught sight of our reflection in one of the ballroom's ornate mirrors. Marcus and I moving in perfect synchrony, his tall frame complementing mine, our expressions peaceful and content. We fit together not because one of us had altered ourselves to accommodate the other, but because we had each arrived in the relationship as whole, complete individuals. It was, I realized, everything I had ever truly wanted. Not the status of being a successful architect or engaged to someone from the right social circle, but the joy of being truly seen and valued for exactly who I was. Ladies, if you're watching this and something in my story resonates with you, I want to speak directly to your heart for a moment. When someone betrays you, whether it's a partner, a friend, or a colleague, it can feel like they've taken everything. From you, your trust, your confidence, your sense of self. I know that darkness intimately, but here's what I learned through my journey, and what I hope you'll take away from this story. They can never take your power unless you give it to them. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. Your future isn't limited by someone else's betrayal. Your identity isn't defined by being someone's victim. The path forward isn't about revenge or proving your value to those who failed to see it. It's about reclaiming your narrative, rebuilding on your own terms, and redirecting your energy toward creating rather than reacting. This isn't easy work. There will be days when grief overwhelms you, when doubt creeps back in, when the unfairness of it all seems too much to bear. Feel those feelings, honor them, but don't let them become your permanent address. The greatest triumph isn't showing your betrayers what they lost, though I won't deny that can be satisfying. The true victory is reaching a place where their opinion no longer matters to your sense of self-worth. I rebuilt my life not to prove something to James and Robert, but to discover who I could become without the constraints of that relationship. The woman I found was stronger, more authentic, and far more capable than the one who had defined herself as someone's partner or fiancé. You have that same strength within you, the same capacity for resilience, the same potential for a life more authentic and fulfilling than the one you're mourning. Trust yourself again. Forgive yourself for not seeing the signs. Allow yourself to grow from this experience rather than being diminished by it. And know that the darkest chapter of your story can become the foundation for its most triumphant turn. Your happiest days aren't behind you. They're ahead, waiting to be written by the woman you're becoming through this fire. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.